We continue in Genesis 44 and complete the chapter today, but not the chiasm that began at the beginning of chapter 43, as you can see on the right side of the screen in the green box there. And so we're on this section here, the second audience with Joseph, following this rhythm that we saw earlier in chapter 42, starting with Jacob sending his sons and ending with the sons reporting back to Jacob, and the arrival in Egypt, the audience with Joseph in custody, the second audience, and departure from Egypt. So the first time we saw it through all of one chapter, and now it's 3 chapters. And one thing we might want to ask here as we reach the end of chapter 44 and Judah's speech, the longest speech in the book of Genesis, is what was Joseph's purpose in doing all these different tricks? Putting the silver in their bags twice, giving Benjamin 5 times as much food, putting his silver cup in Benjamin's bag, and then bringing them back one more time. And I've been trying to resist the notion that many scholars seem unable to resist of assuming we can discern Joseph's motives already. But we cannot, because he's hiding behind his imperial facade, and he's not giving us any explanation, so we can only guess. When we get to chapter 45, after he finally confesses who he is and they're terrified, we at least hear his explanation to them about it. Whether that's what he really believes, it's hard to know, but that's the best we're going to get. Although as an imperial person, we often have to ask, how much is this in his role as an imperial person, and how much is it in his role as Joseph as son and brother? Are those even separable at this point in the story? We'll have to discern that more as we go. So I won't go over all the other things here in these themes and structure that we've been seeing all on the way. Here we have the shape of the chapter, and we have Judah's speech here beginning here. Judah stepped up to him in verse 18. And I've shaped this as a rough chiasm, ABA. It's not really that tight, but here in the paragraph we looked at last time, it was retelling, really, not just recalling, what happened when Judah spoke to Joseph, the vizier of Egypt, last time. Then we'll get here to when he returns to Canaan and what he told Jacob, and then we have the conclusion here as he's speaking directly to Joseph in the present tense. And as we noted last time, I looked at this comparison of the story in chapter 42 and the retelling here and all these different changes. And you can see how, first of all, it's obviously much shorter in the repetition, and all these different changes were shaped to give Judah the maximum sense of Joseph empathy from the story, although there's no reason to think he has much empathy for them, and yet here they are. And what else can he do? As he said at the beginning, what else can I speak? Then in our part here, we'll see how it's comparing what we saw at the beginning of chapter 43, at the beginning of this chiasm, when they were still up there in Canaan with Jacob, and he sends them back. And we see again how it's much shorter, and we'll look at these changes today. And so as I looked at last time, it's worth looking at again. The entire Joseph story has a whole series of tellings and retellings. And this is not the last one. We'll see another one here in 45, when on the beginning of chapter 45, Joseph tells the brothers, go tell my father this, and we'll see how what they tell him is only part of it, partly because he cuts them off, and partly because the narrator just summarizes retelling it. But then there's 2 more. At the end, it'll conclude with the brothers telling a false story that quote-unquote recalls Jacob's deathbed instructions, and quotes there because it never happened. They're making that up. So whatever reform we might imagine has happened in the brothers, in the end they're still afraid of Joseph, much like Jacob was still afraid of his brother Esau when they reunited, but they lie to him, perhaps like Jacob does, although what Jacob said at the time wasn't an explicit lie. It was a claim that he has to go slowly because of the children. Esau didn't challenge him on it, but we asked the question of, is that really realistic or not? You can decide for yourselves. So let's just jump right back into our scene here in verse 24. And my notes below here often are just the changes that I've summarized in the chart, so we won't go over all those. And again, a reminder in terms of language, whenever the New RSV translates servant, it's really ebed, slave. And since slavery is part of what's being offered here, that Judah would be the slave in place of Benjamin, and certainly in the place of all of them, which was the original plan, we need to hear that it's the same word. And so we see slave, slave, slave all over the place here. So now he's reporting what he went back to do. And let's put up here the comparison so we can see. We went back to your servant, my father, and notice what that's suggesting. Jacob in Canaan, Judah is presenting as the servant of the vizier of Egypt. And I've been suggesting all along that the famine is not as much a meteorological or a climatological function, And it is never described that way. It's never a function of drought. It's just a function of years of famine and years of plenty. But in Canaan, I suggested then, and this is another one of the hints, there'll be more hints to go, that it's really just a matter of Egypt controlling the grain supply to what is almost certainly a province at that point, or a region under their control. Because Jacob and his family are shepherds, and so they've had animals to eat all along, and milk to drink, and yogurt, all those things that Abraham and Sarah offered the visitors back in chapter 18. So they're really not completely desperate for food. But this statement here, your father, my servant, your servant, my father, certainly suggests that even the people in Canaan are subject to hegemony from Egypt. Or at least that's what they're saying here, whether that's the realistic political situation or they're just trying to curry favor with the Lord, which is what they describe him here. We told him the words of my Lord. And we could go back and compare that. Here it's just in summary. So what we have here is Judah here saying to Joseph now that we were in Canaan, and told Jacob then the words of Joseph right in front of them there. None of that is narrated. Then we get to what he said. Our father said, go again, buy us a little food. And as my note below had, that's not exactly what we said. He didn't say before he said buy us a little more food. So here buying a little food is suggesting it's the first time, although it's obviously not the first time. And whether we think of him as Joseph or the vizier, he certainly knows that. So they quote him there almost exactly verbatim. And then we said, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother goes with us will we go down. For we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. And notice what they're saying there. They're not saying to Joseph, reporting what they said to Jacob, that it's Joseph who said that. They're not saying that the man said, you will not see my face unless our youngest brother is with us. They're making it sound like it's their issue, not his issue. We cannot see. But certainly they would not be implying that. That was certainly coming from him. And that's what we see here. So let's look at these changes before we go any further. So summarizing in the verse we just saw in 24, the entire exchange from 10 verses from 29 to 38, which is before this, so I didn't put those on. Omitting Judah's previous, the man solemnly warned us at 43:3, which we see here. So that took that out in exchange for what we just read there, only if our youngest brother goes with us. So taking out that threat, and obviously taking out the fact that they told Jacob that the person in front of them threatened them. Then omitting Jacob's grumbling at his son, so he ends up looking a lot better in the story. Adding 44:27 to 29, this part that we'll look at, adapted from the first exchange at 42:38 with the emphasis on my woman. So we'll look at that there. So they leave things out and they add things, plainly designed to get the maximum effect from Joseph. And I won't ask the question again here, I'll just put it out there for you to consider, of how much is this entire story, with all its many tellings and retelling, telling us something about the relationship of history and narrative. In a way that they didn't have the divisions that we, certainly an older person like me, and I'm sure you've grown up with too, between fiction and nonfiction, between fiction as untrue and nonfiction as true. But the Bible doesn't have that distinction. And this story of the Joseph going back and forth, with the brothers going back and forth between Joseph and Canaan, is certainly illustrating what happens when you tell stories and retell stories and people only have partial information based on a story that is inherently only partial. That's a theme we're not going to explore in detail, but just want to put it out there as we go further into Judah's speech here. So he says, then your servant, my father, again repeating that, said to us, you know that my wife or my woman, there's no word for wife or husband in biblical Hebrew, so it's my woman, bore me 2 sons. And notice what's going on there. He had 4 women, 2 primary women and 2 secondary women. Obviously the sisters Rachel and Leah as the primary women that he worked 7 years each for to Laban. But he refers to this in the singular, that he only has 1 woman. Joseph obviously knows about that. The vizier of Egypt doesn't know about that. But notice that they're highlighting, perhaps this is what Joseph wanted to hear all along, that in the end, it's Joseph and Benjamin and Rachel that are most important to Jacob. The others just happen to be there because of what Laban did in requiring Jacob to work 7 more years for the wife who was younger. So let's continue. One left me, or literally came out, an unusual way to speak of a death. And plainly at this point, Judah thinks that he's dead, and we know that Jacob thought he was dead right from chapter 37, given the coat with goat blood that they showed him. Does Jacob actually believe that Joseph just ran away and then died, and they just happened to find his shirt? We don't know. And I said, surely he has been torn to pieces. and that's echoing the Torah that we heard back in 37:33. And as Westerman notes, Father's cry, quote, still echoes in the brothers' ears. As Turner notes, however, Judah knows that it is not true, yet reports it to Joseph as if it was, quote, Judah continues the masquerade, which is to say that Judah certainly knows that Jacob thought that Joseph was torn to pieces, but Judah obviously knows that he wasn't, that was a ruse on their part. And continues, and I've never seen him since. And how ironic is that? It's Jacob speaking there, he's never seen him since, but he's speaking in the presence of a Judah who's talking directly to him and sees him. So he continues, and this is all just made up as far as we know in Judah's voice, putting it in the words of Jacob. If you take this one from me and harm comes to me, and I noted earlier the word for harm implies something like a mortal accident, you will bring my gray hairs in sorrow down to Sheol, echoing 32:38 there. And so that's the speech he gives. And what is the effect of that on Joseph? It's hard to know. Judah's not done with his speech yet. So let's continue to see what he does. Having summarized the past, now he speaks directly to Joseph about the future. Now, therefore, or vata could also be translated and now, when I come to your servant or your slave, that's the third time we're hearing that, my father, your servant, my slave, your slave, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life. And this is a tricky thing to translate. Queshura, and it's really nephesh twice, which Westerman, using an older form of this, translates on whom his whole soul hangs. But since the very concept of soul is foreign to the Bible, and then even the New RSV translates it as life, nephesh is one's being, one's life, in the sense of one's entity that's earth stuff and God stuff, as we see back in Genesis 2:7. So in this life, in that sense, their nefeshes are bound together. It's literally a conspiracy. Queshura means a conspiracy. Their lives are breathing together. It's like they're one body. And that's an interesting thing. But the only other person that's described that way in 1 Samuel 18 is David and Jonathan described that way. So here it's father and son, and then it's just two male friends whose lives are deeply bound together. We've not heard Jacob say that, but plainly what Judah is naming here is not a deception. It's what his perception is of the reality of their father's feelings about Joseph, and in this case, Benjamin. And when he sees that the boy is not with us, recalling 37:30 and 42:13, see how it's all coming together here. The with us is not in the Hebrew, but supplied by the Septuagint. So in the Hebrew, it would simply be when he sees that the boy is not, he will die. And it may well have been the case. If they don't bring Benjamin back, that might be the last straw for Jacob. So this might not be hyperbole for the sake of getting Benjamin out. Judah may well be naming the exact reality, and that may well be what Joseph understands as the risk here. And your servants or slaves will bring the gray hairs of your servant our father one more time with sorrow to Sheol. I probably should have made that a key word here now that I see how many times it's there, but I didn't quite do it that way. But now you can just see it for yourselves. So that's a pretty dire situation. In other words, if you don't do what we say, you're going to kill our father. And then he continues. He's not done yet. For your servant became surety for the boy. Using the word Arev here, and echoing what we saw in 38, the pledge, Erevon, that he gave to Tamar. And I'd like to suggest now that it's perhaps precisely this memory and association that softens his heart and leads to his self-sacrificial offer. And in light of scholars who, in the older source understanding, see chapter 38 as somehow an insertion separately, and it is an insertion in the sense that it interrupts the plot of the Joseph story, but I highlighted at the time how chapters 37, 38, and 39 were all tightly bound by keywords and patterns, and now we see how they're actually bound by motive. Because Judah's experience there in being proved wrong in front of Tamar, having been shown that his first judgment could be wrong, and he was willing to be publicly shamed and dishonored by highlighting that this woman tricked him and ended up giving her the son that she wanted all along so that he could get a continuation of his name as well. Perhaps in the years since then, he's learned something from that. And we look back at the story of the relationship with the brothers, we can see that not only is Judah the only one who speaks more than once, but we can see that perhaps he's been the leader all along. He's the one, after all, who saved Joseph from being killed by having him only be sold. And he's been speaking relative truth here on behalf of Benjamin and on behalf of their father. And I just want to ask, as we consider that, as my note in the lower left notes, what might this be saying about the polities, the nations of Judah and Israel? With Jacob it's Israel, and he'll be Israel again, as we see in chapter 45. But about Judah, that Judah is the one of all the tribes who will unite Benjamin back with Jacob and back with the others. That will require more exploration, but we'll do that when we get to the end of the Joseph story and summarize what we've seen. So your slave became surety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame in the sight of my father all my life. Literally, it was all the days, but that doesn't matter so much. And there it is. He's speaking the exact truth there, but he's not done yet. Now, therefore, or as we saw last time, and now, please. The first please, the last one is at chapter 40:14, when Joseph said to the cupbearer, please remember me when things go well for you. So please let your slave remain as a slave. And that's the key point, that it's the same word there. And remain otherwise wouldn't make sense if they weren't the same. So the RSV is internally inconsistent. But when we hear it as it is, it makes perfect sense. Let your slave remain as a slave, or literally settle in as a slave, to my Lord in place of the boy, a substitutionary act on his part. And let the boy go back with his brothers, or ascend or go back up. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? And as Westerman knows that, now he leaves out the formula, your servant or your slave. Finally, at the end, it's just about son and father. And Judah is simply pouring out the truth. There's no way he can go back. He promised, and if he goes back breaking his promise, what would even be the point of going back? So as he sees it, either Benjamin gets out or my life is destroyed, and I might as well be a slave here, because I simply, as he says, I fear to see the suffering or the evil that would come upon my father. And we won't go into chapter 45, but it doesn't take much for you to see that was the end for Joseph. He can't take it anymore. And when we look at what he says, we'll have to explore, as we do, why this round? What was the point of the silver cup? And if the issue is he cares about his father and Benjamin, why didn't he just go see them earlier? We can't answer those questions now, but we will continue. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.